Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Data Governance, What Dark Secrets Lurk in Your Salesforce Instance, sponsored by RevCult. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Dave Shackelford, SANS Analyst and CEO of Voodoo Security, and Brian Olierczyk, Chief Revenue Officer at RevCult. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to Dave.
Hey, thanks, Carol, and thanks everybody for joining us today. This is such a great topic because it represents sort of a shift in the industry and frankly in the thinking around provisioning out to third-party services that I don't really feel like a lot of organizations fully understand. And that's not to say that security professionals don't have some concept or sort of understanding of what they're doing and sort of where they're going. But the larger part of the organization often feels that they're making use of these third-party services. And of course, in this case, things like Salesforce and other very highly regarded SaaS platforms, without realizing that there's a lot more going on. Perhaps behind the scenes, maybe where the cloud providers aren't doing all the things you thought they were going to be doing. And then really understanding that shared responsibility model where, frankly, there's a lot more on our plate than we had realized. And there's some needs for us to make use of other services to really bolster our security posture as we're going forward. So, the name, I think, sort of says it all. There might be, in fact, some dark secrets lurking in Salesforce instances that a lot of business constituents and other stakeholders outside the realm of security don't understand, and it's our job to make sure that they do. So let's go on ahead to the next slide, if you don't mind. And I'm excited to be joined by Brian. We're going to be talking about some fun and exciting things out in the cloud. And the cloud, of course, is always evolving, always changing, and there's lots of interesting things to say about that. So I think we've spent enough time with today's speaker slide with me and Brian, so let's go on. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah,
and so, exactly. Yeah, we gotta kick it off here. So, the fun and exciting part about being a part of SANS, and for those of you that have been around for a bit or have heard some of our different research paths in the past, you know that I've sort of been beating this drum of cloud security for well over 10 years. And in fact, I laugh when I look back and I say, I sort of saw this coming and I was yelling about cloud long before anybody really thought cloud was going to take off. But we've all gradually come to the realization that despite our protestations, the business stakeholders have decided to make moves to cloud. And there's often very good reasons to do so. So today we've got lots of different sort of avenues to cloud. We've got different types of cloud delivery models. We've got lots of different security frameworks that we've been working on and developing. But nonetheless, all that said, we still have lots of problems. And, I could cherry pick any number of different ones. And certainly, you could point at any number of different SaaS providers or platform providers or even infrastructure providers. But the name of the game is exposed S3 buckets or open APIs or, just cloud provider outages. And in fact, I think maybe more relevant to this conversation in particular, S3 buckets, it's us screwing up and not knowing what we're doing. It's open Kubernetes APIs, again, us screwing up and not knowing what we're doing. And in the last case, it's Microsoft. Well, perhaps we thought we knew what we were doing, but nonetheless, the provider had a major problem with DNS back in February and caused us some significant pain. Regardless of the reason, we still have problems with cloud, and it's incumbent upon us to really think through where those problems might be circumvented or ideally completely mitigated before they happen. So yeah, we've got some controls. Yeah, we've got some better processes starting to emerge. But looking at the organizations that I work with as a consultant, and in particular, as I'm about to go through talking about some of the research that we've done here at SANS and thinking through our results out of the 2019 security survey we did, a lot of the biggest problems are actually in places like software as a service and platform as a service. And that is exactly where we're going to go in this discussion. So let's go on ahead to the next slide. Oh, you got it.
Yeah, David, I think that makes perfect sense, and I think you hit the thing that really resonated for me on that was cloud security is a big bucket, but there are dramatic differences between infrastructure, software, and platforms in terms of the shared responsibility model that I think is often underappreciated, and so yeah, this is fun stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and you know, the thing is, and I always tell my students this when I teach them, and you know, hey, I'll hang out with you guys and tell you the same story. I'm the first to admit when I make mistakes, and I've made them all. I feel like I've made them all anyway, and you know, over 2 decades of security experience. But I'll tell you, this whole shared security model or shared responsibility model that goes along with that, I feel like I sort of had this expectation that everybody would get it immediately and that people would sort of rally around this and that stakeholders would go, oh, yeah, okay, cool. Here's where the line is drawn. You know, these cloud providers are going to take on this and we're going to take on this and we're going to have this sort of harmonious experience going forward. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I've had numerous cases where there were just sort of eye-opening moments in meetings and other things where I sort of sat there dumbfounded when, frankly, very smart people in various roles looked across the table at all the other people there and said, yeah, we're fine because cloud provider X is going to handle this for us. And you're just shaking your head going, well no, actually, they're not actually going to take on any of those things. And you're supposed to know this before you go out and deploy things there, and frankly, they don't. So it's not that uncommon. I think, you know, before it's you know, you want to point a finger, you want to have sort of a sarcastic view of things. This is our job, is to help educate people, is to tell people what their responsibilities are. Do not make the assumption that everybody understands that. And looking at some of the research we've done at SANS, you know, that's echoed here. I mean, we definitely saw more breaches this year, more cases where people just maybe didn't understand what they were doing and they provisioned cloud assets or cloud data sets and perhaps left things wide open or, you know, somewhat open, at least enough to allow providers or the attackers to come into the provider environments. And again, we'll get to some more specifics around that. We had a lot of people trying to get to sort of data or data sets related to security from those providers. And I will tell you right now, the worst is SaaS. You know, you want to get logs, you want to get event data, especially in a real-time format. You're going to be really struggling if you're trying to do so in a native SaaS-based or even platform-based format. And one of the things we really also discovered was that, frankly, there's a lot of skepticism and hesitancy on the part of providers to provide more detail or really give more detail when people are you know, sort of drilling into them and asking for this. ISO reports are common and popular, but nobody really believes 100% of what they're being told by the providers. That's unhealthy. I mean, we can all laugh again about that being sort of silly and saying, well, you know, maybe that's the tinfoil hat syndrome in the realm of security, but it's really a bad situation when you're doing business with providers, you're being driven by business expectations, and yet you don't inherently trust any of the information, or at least partially the information being given to you.
Yeah, and I guess, do you want to be secure or do you want to feel secure? Yep.
Both, you know. I think both, right? But at the end of the day, that's still tough to achieve. So these are some base statistics, and for those of you that aren't familiar with our survey, you know, and it's all available for free, you know, on the SANS site. You can go check all the details. I tried to give the most salient pieces here that I think are relevant. But if we look at what people are actually doing in the cloud, I'll tell you one of the things that happens is people sort of think, it's Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, right? Like there's this triumvirate of infrastructure as a service that tend to get a lot of the attention. But that's not at all what people are really using. I mean, they are using those, but the astonishingly vast majority of cloud is really SaaS. SaaS is most of what people are doing, and it's really business applications and data sets that are driving this. So we saw some drops this year in specific types of workforce apps. Some people that are really sort of reeling in or changing their model of things like cloud storage or other things. But in terms of like actual business applications, it's huge, right? Storage and archival is big. Server workloads are starting to grow. Some security services are starting to grow. But when people say cloud, don't fall into the trap of thinking that it's those sort of big three infrastructure service providers, although they make a lot of noise and certainly have lots of security services or other things that are emerging over time. Most of cloud really comes back to software as a service. It's that shift of things that we've struggled with on premise or have reasons to believe are better served moving to cloud in terms of applications. And that's where it goes first. So let's go to the next slide. And this just sort of shakes it out a little bit more and shows you that, yeah, business applications and data, I mean, that's 3/4 of the respondents to our survey this year said, yep, that's where we are. That doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, if you go and look at a lot of the other analyst firms like Gartner and Forrester and others, they echo the exact same things. And the numbers vary. You'll see sometimes people saying 80+%, sometimes people a little closer to 70, but somewhere between 70 and 80% of cloud use. And the driving model for people moving to cloud in the first place, yeah, it's software as a service. And following that, of course, is things like certain storage or archiving tools, server virtualization or workloads, and again, that might be things like EC2 or, Azure virtual machines. Security services are getting more popular, managed services are getting more popular. You can sort of look at that almost flat line in the middle and see that there's a broad mix in terms of the responses, but hey, that big number at the top tells it all. Those are critical business services that people are employing. And things like Salesforce, right at the top of the list. I mean, Salesforce, in fact, I would argue is one of the world's top cloud services solely because trying to provision and use CRM services and all the related components that now have extended into even their platform model are extraordinarily difficult to get at scale and with cost efficiency on premise. So they knew this, right? Mark Benioff certainly knew this a long time ago, and here we are. So there you go. That's maybe the backdrop to the whole conversation, right?
Yeah, makes a ton of sense.
Yep. Let's go to the next slide. So a couple things to just point out, and it's tough to cherry pick these data points, and I'm sure Brian has a million thoughts on all of this stuff because he's out there dealing with this just like everybody, but I laugh sometimes when I ask this question, and I've been asking it consistently since we started this survey. What are you guys doing? Are you putting sensitive data in the cloud? And I ask about, all these different types of data. And the really short answer to this is, well, yes. And maybe the slightly longer answer, yet still short, is the variety and types of sensitive data are expanding broadly and rapidly. So people are more comfortable putting things like business intelligence and customer data and personal information and even things like financial records and so forth out in the cloud. This is going to continue to grow. I don't see this actually going back down the other way. I think people are going to add more sensitive records and data into the cloud progressively in the next few years. I don't know, Brian, do you feel that this is happening? Are you seeing a lot of your customers doing the exact same thing? Is this the correct trend?
Yeah, I would. This is certainly something that we're seeing, and again, today we're focused on the Salesforce ecosystem, but Salesforce, it's not a CRM. I mean, it still has the foundational element of a CRM, but it is a platform, and folks are building line of business applications and processes all the way from loan origination through EHR, through things like HR processes within Salesforce. And I think so we're certainly seeing the amount of data being stored in the cloud and the type of data, I would say conceptually being more sensitive. I guess, are you seeing folks take that next level of taking that theoretical, yes, we're capturing more sensitive data, but actually going through and doing a data inventory so that they can really assess the value of that data? Or is it just a quote unquote, yes, there's sensitive data in there and therefore we care more about it? What are you seeing practically of people being able to actually apply an operational process to this idea that sensitive data should be protected differently?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, we see somewhat of a combination here. I mean, there are plenty of organizations that just feel like, well, Salesforce, as an example, of course, is a mature provider. They have a lot of controls or a lot of things they purport to offer us in terms of security. we feel confident just moving data out there without necessarily worrying about all the specifics around, the governance and the process orientation of managing and maintaining and monitoring those data types, et cetera. But the more mature and the larger organizations are a bit more cautious and tend to have a little bit more orientation around those processes and saying, hey, this data type or that data type, we've got to be a bit more prudent in evaluating the specific controls that either are or aren't there as we go out to places like Salesforce. But nonetheless, they're still going. It doesn't change the fact that they've made huge business decisions to move.
Right.
And, again, even if security professionals say, well, here's this gap or that gap or some things we just don't know, that doesn't often tend to completely hold the works up.
Yeah, and I think the things you don't know, it's coming back to the topic, what dark secrets lurk in that instance, and Salesforce being one of those instances, and there may be others. And I think that's the whole, what's important for the kind of the audience as a whole is that knowing that there's sensitive data is a great starting point. And now it's how do you get visibility to understanding what sensitive data, and based on how you value that data, how you should be thinking about it differently or protecting it differently based on that shared responsibility model.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, and we can certainly move on, but I will tell you the idea here seems to be more of this, I don't want to say blind trust, but the perception that you're not going to, it's almost like the old adage, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Well, nobody ever got fired for provisioning into Salesforce either, but do you really understand the delineation of responsibility as it pertains to Salesforce's accommodation of your data and what they give you? I don't think a lot of people inherently understand that when they move there. They just go, Salesforce, big name. These guys obviously are mature. They know what they're doing. But if you look at the data types that are going into Salesforce, and this is a perfect slide to hit that on, it's a ton of sensitive data. And often it's very sensitive data related to privacy. And with the age of GDPR upon us, and GDPR to me being the baseline, right? A lot of different countries are really expanding and enhancing what's offered in GDPR or required in GDPR to have their own specifics. You got a lot of things to wrangle here, right? Privacy is definitely growing in concern, but I mean, is anybody really dealing with that across the board and maybe thinking, well, Salesforce has me covered? I don't think that's actually accurate at all. Well, let's go on to the next slide. Here we go. So concerns and threats in the cloud. I could expand on this forever. In fact, I could spend, probably a good half hour just hanging out right here. But let me hit some key points that people came back and told us they were worried about. We looked back in, the last 2 years over doing the surveys that we do, and we saw that, unauthorized access was a big deal. And obviously unauthorized access was sort of the top concern consistently over the past several times we did the survey. But we saw that grew a little bit, in 2017, went down a little bit this time, but still was the highest category. The second position that we saw was the inability to respond to things. Again, sort of came up a lot actually from the last time we did this. 48% said, hey, we just don't feel like we have, sort of the insights that we need, log events and data that would tell us what's going on, especially in real time. Lack of visibility is definitely a big one. Unauthorized access from other cloud tenants. And I think you look at somebody like Salesforce, there are, hundreds, thousands of other tenants hanging out there. Do we really have a good understanding of the isolation mechanisms that Salesforce has? Salesforce has to keep our data separate from those other tenants. If you ask 10 different people, you'll get 10 different answers, but most of them still generally resonate back to, no, I don't know all the ways that's being done, right? So if I look at a theme here, and, again, Brian, I'm sure you've heard these things, it's this feeling of the unknown, right? Like what's in there, what's happening. I can't get enough logs to satisfy me. I don't know what the other tenants in there are doing. Is that something you're hearing too?
Yeah, I think that we hear that all the time. And I think part of what we see is a big shift, especially over the last 12 to 24 months, is just an appreciation that within the info security or compliance or governance organizations that they need to be thinking about Salesforce. If you were to look 2 years ago, it was Salesforce their infrastructure is tremendously secure, and we're we're using Salesforce, so we're good. And I think that was the right answer, maybe the only answer 4 years ago when we started doing this. And over the last couple of years, I think even over the last couple of weeks with CISOs of Fortune 1000 organizations, and not only are they asking better questions to address this, but they're also, I think the Heisman response of, no, we're good, or our system integrators got, doing Salesforce, we're covered. I think there's the blind trust mentality has started to shift and started to not be acceptable, which is a great thing from a threat vector standpoint. It's a great thing from while there's maybe not be tremendous known breaches on Salesforce, it's the unknown breaches of internal IP and malicious bad actors that took internal credentials that are the real threat of that customer data that lives in this environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And actually, you made the point a moment ago that Salesforce has become so extensible as a platform. You're not dealing with just standard relational database type records any longer. You're dealing with extraordinarily broad API-driven access models into this, platform service that has all sorts of ways that data could be presented, exposed, sliced and diced. And given that you can do all these things as an organization, well, what are your other neighbors doing? And no one really knows. There's sort of this lack of comfort altogether with the way that Salesforce has expanded and sort of enhanced their service. And that's not uncommon. I mean, a lot of the larger providers are sort of expanding their service models, and Salesforce certainly represents that.
Yep.
So why don't we move on and hit the second piece of this slide? And again, it's very easy to sort of just hang out and talk about things people are worried about. Downtime concerns were big, of course. I mean, anytime you got a critical business service, the cloud provider going down and having a problem, well, that's classic third-party service use, concerns that you're going to still realize. The big change that we saw this year, however, was actually a realized increase in unauthorized access. And that matters a lot. I mean, if you go through the news, it doesn't take a whole lot. I mean, you could spend 5 minutes and come up with this. Things like account hijacks are just rampant. And given that something like Salesforce, I mean, think about what Salesforce represents, or common core SaaS platforms or platform services represent, they're integral to a variety of different application scenarios for a huge number of constituents and business units. And so this might be your sales team, this might be your marketing team, this might be your finance team, it might be, any number of teams that rely on access to core and critical data sets in different ways. If those people's accounts get hijacked, or if there's some sort of unauthorized access into those accounts, there's just an enormous number of different scenarios that could play out. And we've seen that. And people are really responding and saying, hey, that is in fact happening. In fact, we saw this come in at over double the percentage that it was the last time. So the last time we did this survey, we only saw 12%, and this time it was 28%. That's close to a third of respondents saying they saw some of this, and that is huge. And right along with that, we saw configuration problems with components and APIs. And again, you talk about something like a platform model like Salesforce, and they've got innumerable extensions now available for developing and building software that accesses data sets in their core infrastructure. All of those tie together to really create, like, I would argue, almost nightmare scenarios for many organizations today. Do you think that's true, Brian?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that we're seeing in the marketplace is really responsiveness to closing down, or at least a proactively addressing those different considerations. And I think again, a few years back, you would say, yeah, we've got two-factor authentication in Salesforce and we're good. But the reality is the platform's really extensible, and so two-factor authentication may prevent someone from getting into your environment. But if there was that the credentials were hijacked, we've seen customer service reps that have access to PHI, or interns that have had access to social security numbers, and so being able to control who gets into the building is a great starting point. But you also should apply the concept of least privileged access with once you get into the building, to make sure that you have multiple ways to prevent those attacks or those internal threats. And again, if you think about the last slide, it's not the known ones that are caused. You don't see Salesforce in the journal. You don't see it on the largest port. on the largest breach listings, because the infrastructure is very secure. It's the internal bad actors that had access to things that they shouldn't have access to, largely in many ways not because of malicious intent, but because of the extensibility of the platform and the line of business just going really, really fast, which is great. And it also needs to be controlled based on the sensitivity and how you value that data. So it's a balance. I think and it is getting more balanced, and we're certainly seeing that across our customer base.
Yeah, and that's fair. I think people are starting to come to their senses, realizing that there's so many things they still have to wrangle, and that there's lots of opportunity for misconfiguration or account, just maybe inattention that they haven't really focused on. And people are starting to focus on this. But wow, given the number of accounts that are out there and the number of users that are accessing something like this, there's just still so much opportunity for things to go wrong. So let's go on to the next slide. And really just to finish the thought, because I think it's easy to say, well, everybody's worried about things. You want to go, well, okay, so you're worried about things, but what actually happened here? And so that's naturally the next line of questioning that we went into. And I think it's relevant here because you say, well, for those of you that actually had a problem, what was really involved in it? And so, I look at these kinds of numbers. This is sort of the initial question saying, did you really have a breach or did you really have a problem? And we had about 10.5% say, well, yep, we surely did. If you have, another 10.5% that say, yeah, we think so, but we can't prove it. Let me go on ahead and direct you. That's probably a yes. So that puts us at about 21% that's probably having some sort of a problem. 7% said they were unknown. If you're not really sure, again, that skepticism usually, sort of points in the something may have happened, and that might be getting us closer to about a quarter of the respondents. And then you say, well, not that we know of. Well, what does that mean? Don't know, right? It means maybe you don't have the visibility you need, maybe you don't have logging. These results are highly inconclusive, and we really wish we had better, more granular and finite results that we could point to and say, okay, this is absolutely how it went down. My gut tells me, based on industry experience as a consultant, that, yeah, you've probably got anywhere between a quarter and a third of respondents that experienced some type of exposure. Doesn't mean that it was exposure that had to be reported to regulators or industry authorities. It might have been exposure of internal data sets or intellectual property, things you really don't want to make known, especially if you're not a publicly traded company or one that has to report it. But what it shows you is that the numbers are growing, right? There's more people either sure or really hesitant about responding in the affirmative or negative that, hey, we've had a breach. We don't know. There's a lot of things out there that we're just unsure of. And Brian, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just sort of expand that a little bit and say, what was actually happening. For those that did say they either had a breach or think they might have had a breach, so this was, including a degree of skepticism, right there at the top of the list. I don't think anybody that's hanging out with us right now is probably surprised by this. It's account hijacking. It's the core problems that we've consistently had. Between that and things like misconfigurations, over-allocation of privileges and privileged user abuse by extension, and then potentially application components we didn't configure right or APIs. Stop right there. If you go to the top 5 things, all of those are immediately relevant to the most prevalent provisioning in the world of SaaS and platform services. And I think that'll probably stay the case. I don't know if those will be the top things or if they'll shift around a little bit, but I think those will probably be the top things that really concern us and actually lead to breaches in the upcoming years. Do you have a feeling that that's the case, or do you have some other things that you have seen consistently out there, Brian?
Yeah, I would say if you look at the biggest buckets that create maybe I guess 2 things. One, they're the easiest to understand, and they're also the easiest to address with the right kind of thought process, with the right strategy and the right operational mechanics to close down. And so I think if you were to take those and to the audience out there and focus purely on those with your mission critical SaaS or platform or PaaS applications, and you would dramatically reduce your threat vector.
That is absolutely possible. And I mean, I think we're still struggling with that, right? I think everybody would love to have an easy answer to say, hey, let's solve this. And I don't know that there is one, right? I don't know that there's one answer that sort of gets everybody where they need to get, but these are the common issues that we're probably all going to encounter in the foreseeable future. So let's go on ahead to the next slide. And what that really does is move us into the next section here. And Brian, I'm going to hand it off to you to kick us off here.
Yeah, and I think just extending that that context of what's happening more broadly, and that research obviously informs where folks should be spending their time and energy. I think maybe just at the highest level, kind of what is Salesforce, and Dave, you mentioned this, kind of the evolution of Salesforce and the extensibility of it. The reality is most of the marketplace that's leveraging Salesforce, especially if you've been using it out over a period of time, you now recognize that it is a mission critical application that's at a minimum housing your customer data, which one would think has a certain level of value to it, and as a maximum is extending into operational processes and line of business data that is very, very sensitive, and that we don't see, I guess, based on all the reports and watching the stock, we see the continued expansion of Salesforce, and they continue to be rounding out the customer 360 platform, which is delivering tremendous value to the business and to business success, and that's happening largely in a way that's been outside of most of the audience that's probably participating today, typically being done by the citizen developers or Salesforce admins or architects that are in the field supporting the line of business. And as that's happened, I think we're now seeing a more balanced shift that folks within the governance and info security are starting to say, well, not just what data do we have in Salesforce, but how do we feel about it? And how do I help give the right information to the owners of Salesforce as a platform or other mission critical PaaS applications, such that they have the context of what controls and how they should be thinking about protecting that data. And so again, there's a misnomer still within many of the CISOs that we speak with that Salesforce is CRM and it's only a CRM. And as they start to peel the onion back a little bit more, especially if you've been using it for a period of time within your organization, you're using it much more than you likely know. You're definitely using it more than you have visibility into, and I think that comes back to kind of the topic of the conversation is kind of what dark secrets lie in that instance. And so I guess, Dave, does that make sense, or anything that you would add in terms of the platform as a whole at a foundational level?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, the big thing I think is somewhat in the definition of SaaS versus platform. And in fact, this is, I mean, I hate to say it's an argument I have. It is actually a little bit of an argument, I guess, in the sense that people don't agree. But to your point, Salesforce stopped being a pure SaaS solution a fairly long time ago. But if you ask people what Salesforce is, they always go, oh, it's software as a service. Well, no, it's not. They extended this and offered tons of things for people to develop into and integrate with years ago. And that's exactly what most people are doing. And they're including brokering solutions and all sorts of other things in this ecosystem. And there's so many moving parts. Well, here you go. More moving parts, more complexity. Great for security, right?
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's also evolved kind of some of the shared responsibility model. And so in a SaaS environment, largely people would say, well, the customer's responsibility is on the data and the people. So controlling access to the people and controlling access to those people in terms of the data, and which is true, and largely, and you could argue kind of if there was other moving parts to it, but largely you can bucketize it into data and people. And as you move into a platform as a service model, now your shared responsibility includes not only the data and the people, but also the applications, because you own the applications. And if you're using, whether you use waterfall or an agile methodology, that application is changing, and it might be changing in various ways throughout your line of business, depending on your organization size and scale. And that is a kind of a moving target, because you can't just say, well, here's my policy. Have we implemented it, or have we turned the policy? Have we implemented that policy within Salesforce? you need to say, here's my policy, have we implemented it? And then do we have the controls in place such that as the application changes, along with the data and the people, that we have verification that we're effectively managing to that policy? And again, whether that policy is based on regulatory drivers, compliance drivers, internal security drivers, whatever it might be, it continues to move. You know, if you're using a 2 to 3 week agile sprint methodology, that moves very, very fluidly. So a conscious thought about how do we maintain from an operational standpoint is really required to manage and reduce the risk. And so kind of jumping into some of the basics, and I'll call them basics because, I don't know, I think Simon said if you start with the why, and those sort of basic things that many of the folks on the call here today are probably thinking about across, you know, whether it's the NIST framework or other methodologies that you're using, you know, how are you applying those methodologies to your internal systems or to your cloud applications? And if you were to think about Salesforce, largely folks are not thinking about Salesforce as that similar mission critical application. And at a very highest level, you know, these are 5 questions to evaluate your risk exposure. 1, do you have a security strategy for Salesforce? What data do you have within your Salesforce instance? How do you value that data? How do you classify it? Have you done a data inventory to determine whether it's sensitive, whether it's PII, whether it applies to other compliance requirements, whether it be FINRA or GLBA or HIPAA, whatever it might be? You can't really assess, you know, how compliant you are based on either your internal or regulatory guidelines if you haven't done that data inventory. And then that informs kind of subsequent things of how you protect that data from an access standpoint, making sure the wrong people don't have access to the wrong information, and from an audit standpoint, making sure that you're maintaining that over time. And at the highest level, if I would say, well, for folks that are joining today that don't own Salesforce but have it in their organization, you know, this is a great place to start to just ask questions and understand that the we're good is probably a reason to drill down a little bit more as opposed to turning away and going and focusing on something else.
Agreed.
So that's the highest level. Quick intro on RevCult, and so this is exactly what we focus on. We focus on security and governance for the platform. We've been doing this for a bunch of years, lots of obviously regulatory experience, and we kind of engage in a couple of different ways. And so for some organizations that are more mature, like you mentioned, Dave, that already have a governance policy, that already have a security strategy for Salesforce, and are looking for tools or products to really operationalize that, those customers like an Intuit or TD Ameritrade, they just leverage our products and they put the products in their org and they align them to their center of excellence, and they take the capabilities out and expose that to their compliance and audit teams. And then for other organizations that are a little bit less mature, I don't want to say immature, but are a little bit less mature and care about security and governance and have Salesforce but don't know where to start, we have a security risk assessment specific to Salesforce that helps inform kind of what's your baseline, and that helps inform your why and determine, is it worthwhile to do more on it in an informed basis as opposed to doing nothing. And so a couple different ways that we engage, and that's real quick, but maybe just from a tactical standpoint, a couple of key questions. So not knowing who can see what. And again, this is a very common thing for the audience and Dave, yourself as well, knowing who has access to the data. And the reality is Salesforce provides tremendous controls or tremendous capabilities to provide access. And most of the folks here probably have two-factor authentication already on. And the controls are very extensible, such that a center of excellence or an admin or an architect can give me access to information based on a variety of ways: profiles, permissions, sharing roles. And it can be very difficult to really see what does Brian have access to in an auditable way, and does Brian have access to more than he or she should. So this is a common kind of a tactical thing. Know who has access to what, and at least ask the question. So we'll go through a couple of common, and then second common thing that we see is moving too fast. So you've got your Salesforce architects, application owners, centers of excellence that are being very responsive to the line of business to bring in more capabilities, to extend to more users. And as they do so, a lot of times they're doing so with leveraging the application or the platform as quickly as they could to support the line of business, and oftentimes will, let's say, take shortcuts, not with a malicious intent, but take shortcuts to be responsive to the line of business with the intention of closing things down and then never getting back to it. And a common use case would be you're provisioning a new user within your Salesforce environment. Your admin provisions that user with admin rights or God privileges, puts a sticky note on their machine and says, all right, I got to go back and take Dave's access off, and because he shouldn't have admin rights, but I needed to go quick. And the sticky note flies away, and all of a sudden, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months later, that Dave still has access to more than he should, and there's very little vehicle in place to be able to enforce that. And so you want to go fast, but do it in a balanced way. And I'd say the last thing that you start to see, and Dave hitting, one of the things that you mentioned earlier on your common access points that caused some of the breaches, insecure integrations. And so, a common use case within the Salesforce ecosystem. So Salesforce is a platform, and you have developers that are building things on it, and that's pretty foundational. But a lot of times, even that is misunderstood. And so, as you're building things on it, your developers, when they're doing integrations to backend systems, oftentimes we'll set up those integration IDs with God privileges because that helps for testing. And then those integrations get promoted into production, and those user IDs never get deprovisioned. And now you've created another internal vulnerability that can be breached. And it's likely if and when that did get breached, you didn't have visibility into it because there's very little controls that you've likely deployed. And so again, these are some of the things that David mentioned on, or Dave, that you had mentioned on your previous slide in terms of likely vulnerabilities are certainly things that exist within the Salesforce ecosystem and the platform itself. Does that make sense, Dave, or anything that you would add?
No, I think this concept of integrations is just getting more and more complicated. These providers are changing their APIs. They're offering more extensibility all the time. And just keeping up with that is challenging enough for developers, let alone security folks. So whether that's more RESTful methods, whether that's more, sort of queryability, different types of reporting mechanisms, data in, data out, it's actually, it's a challenge to just know what's even open, let alone in use.
Yep. So again, these are some likely instances or likely secrets that lurk in your Salesforce instance if you've had Salesforce in your organization for a while. So moving on, so what do you do about it? And we'll go through kind of a couple of, again, very basic and foundational things, and also things that aren't being really done very proactively across the market as a whole in their Salesforce instances. And so one, know your data. And so a lot of conversation around data taxonomy and doing a data inventory to assess and assign value to the data that you have. And that should be applied to Salesforce as well. So do a data classification exercise within your Salesforce environment. Get an understanding of what data you actually have, or what data your admins and developers have actually put into your instance or orgs. And then do it in a way that it persists. Because again, this is not a one-time thing to know your data. Have a vehicle in place to be able to reclassify your data based on your next release to production, based on your sprint cycle. And on the top of the screen is some of the ways that our products help, which gives a quick and direct view into a data classification exercise that allows you to see your data, that allows you to create your own data classification levels, and then assign value based on all the data that you have across all your objects and fields in Salesforce to those classification levels, to then determine how you should protect it. So know your data. We'll go second, know your users. So you have data, you have users. Whether it's SaaS, whether Salesforce is in your vernacular SaaS or PaaS, you need to know your data and manage your people. And so understand all the users in your Salesforce orgs and what they have access to be able to apply least privileged access model or method to your Salesforce environment. And so On the top of the screen, you see we call it a Who Sees What Explorer. That's the vernacular within kind of the Salesforce ecosystem, but allows you to see based on your classification levels. So based on the value that you've assigned to the data, who has access to it and why across all the different ways that a user could have access to it. And again, you want to make sure that Dave, if you shouldn't get into Salesforce, I don't want to let you in. But if you should get in, I don't necessarily need to give you access to everything. So know your users, know your data. Dave, anything to add on that, or does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easier said than done, or the perception is that it's easier said than done. Like, yeah, you should know your users. Yeah, you should know the data, and you should know the sort of intersection of the two. But I would definitely argue that the majority of organizations I've worked with, even those that have fairly robust deployments here, don't really have that sort of sense of what they've got and how they're using it. It still seems like a bit of an elusive goal. So, you know, I don't argue with you that you should know it, but man, it feels like it's really still tough for people to do.
Yeah, I would say I'd say there's a couple of things, and one, folks still probably aren't focusing enough on it. And I would agree with you that for the folks that are, it can be difficult. And so again, we focus on the product capabilities that allow you to do it if you have the expertise and the time to apply that expertise. And then we do a lot of these one-day workshops. And over the last 30 days, with 3 different Fortune 1000 organizations using Salesforce, had been using it for a while. Within one day, we went through an exercise, again, leveraged by the product to know the data and know the users, that provided a blueprint for them to determine how they should protect it. And it's not easy, but if you have the right resources and the right either products or capabilities, you know, you certainly can do it, and it provides a good starting point to determine what you should then do, you know, more downstream based on that. All right, which I guess leads us to the next slide. So you've done your data inventory, you know your data, you've assigned some value to it. You've verified access controls based on the users to that data. And then as you go downstream, based on the value that you've assigned, just determine how you want to to protect and control that data. And, you know, then there's some more robust capabilities that Salesforce provides. They use Salesforce Shield. And I guess Salesforce Shield is a tremendous capability as an add-on premium service to the Salesforce platform. It's not, you don't deploy Shield and become CCPA compliant. You don't deploy Shield and say, yep, I'm GDPR or I'm HIPAA. It's an enablement tool that, again, when deployed correctly with the right configuration, it can align to either regulatory or other drivers. But do it in an informed way and do it in a way that's not just saying my Salesforce team implemented Shield, we're good. That makes maybe you feel good and allows you to say that you've turned on things that you've bought, but not necessarily making you really as secure or reducing any threats. If you encrypt all the data in your org, but then you give your interns access to all that data, your threat vector might not be as reduced as you might think.
Yep.
Make sense?
Yep, absolutely.
All right, we'll do just a quick time check. So RevCult, how we help. We talked earlier about the security risk assessment. And so that's a Salesforce-specific security risk assessment. Gives organizations a sense of you have Salesforce, you care about security and governance, but aren't really sure where to start, don't know the right questions, or don't really have the understanding to dig deeper and to go around the Heisman that you receive from the Center of Excellence. That's a great place to start. And then we've got a variety of products that help do those things that Dave, you mentioned that people want to do and think they should do, but just don't have the right enablement tools to be able to support them. So that's kind of that's how RevCult helps. And then last point that I'll make here is just this security risk assessment, which again is a really common starting point. It is leveraged by the products, and within a few weeks, we produce a very specific risk assessment that allows any organization to inform what they should be doing with Salesforce, what their risks, what remediations, if any, exist, what their threat vectors exist, and then a prioritized plan to determine what should be implemented thereafter. That makes sense, Dave, or anything else that you would add?
No. I mean, I think just having a sense of what's going on in there, especially as you're a bigger organization that's growing and sort of expanding, and particularly, if you've got different business units that all have their own sort of inputs and use cases involved with something like Salesforce as a platform, especially for a centralized security team, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to just even know that. So the more you know, the better you are.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. So there are dark secrets in your Salesforce instance, and you can figure out which they are, and then determine whether they're how dark they are, how important those secrets are, or whether they should continue to be buried, or whether they should be, the light to have shined on them, and then appropriate measures to control put in them. So, and just, I guess, based on some time, we'll do how we help. And so for those that want to learn more, on the RevCult side, we do have a webinar podcast series that we run. We've got resources on the website, and here's my contact information if we can help.
All right, sounds to me you're ready for some questions. Is that right?
I'm good. Dave, anything else that you would do close for a wrapper?
Now let's see what the folks have to ask us.
All right. So our first question, I'm going to read both of them together because they sound pretty similar. He asks, how does your offering integrate with Salesforce Shield? And can you use your service to assess if they actually need Shield?
Yeah, so good questions. And so I guess, so we have, Salesforce Shield, for those that aren't familiar, it's the premium security offering on top of the platform. And there's three components. There's event monitoring, field audit, and then platform encryption, which does encryption at rest. And so our offering, so we do have offerings that sit on top of Shield that allow you to, in an informed way, implement and take advantage of the Shield capabilities. And then we also have offerings that extend beyond Shield. And so the who sees what capability, which is the roles-based access control for authorization, is independent of Shield. And so for those organizations that have Shield, we can certainly add value on top of that. For those organizations that don't, we can certainly add value on top of that. And then I'd say, as it relates to a common thing people say is, do I need Shield? Or I'm in regulated industries, or my Salesforce account executive says all other healthcare companies have Shield, or other. And so that's a common thing questions that we get, and the answer is, one of the great values of the security risk assessment is that it informs what do you need and why. And I think that starts with a one-day on-site workshop where we're really determining your why based on your industry, based on your security or governance posture or other compliance or regulatory drivers. That helps inform kind of what are either the threat vectors or what are the compliance requirements that you need to implement. And one of the common questions that gets answered as part of that is, do I need Shield? And if I need Shield, what elements of Shield do I need? Do I just need encryption at rest, or do I just need to track the event logs? So the answer to that second question is certainly yes. That's one of the values of the security risk assessment, because people say, I want to solve this. I've got the right people in the room. I just don't know where to start. And so that security risk assessment really gives you a foundation for where to start, and answer questions like, do I need Shield or not?
All right, thank you. How does RevCult work with Salesforce?
So we collaborate we collaborate pretty well with Salesforce. We've been in the ecosystem for quite a while, and again, Salesforce, tremendous platform. It's tremendously secure. They invest a lot of time and energy and resources into the infrastructure, and because they've got customers across all industries, across all sizes, their capabilities need to be very, very extensible. And so what we do is we sit on top of Salesforce, and we're part of the App Exchange, and we collaborate very closely with their product organization and their go-to-market teams to make sure that we're developing capabilities that help on areas that leverage the capabilities that they're working really hard on. And so I'd say it's a pretty symbiotic relationship. Ultimately, end customers are able to bring more data into Salesforce when they feel more secure, or when InfoSec is part of the process as opposed to being an afterthought. And so there's a lot of collaboration on individual customer engagements based on, really an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish.
All right, thanks. Are there capabilities in Salesforce such as geo-blocking, WAF, etc.?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Carol?
Sure. Are there capabilities in Salesforce such as geo-blocking, WAF, etc., which maybe that doesn't quite apply to this webcast, but we'll give it a shot?
Yeah, no, you can there are certainly advanced controls that provide for location-based access controls. And so one of the things that we show on our compliance dashboards is, where people have access to. And Pete Thurston, who is in Switzerland today, and unfortunately he wasn't here to join us, but if you were to look into our demo environments and see kind of where he used to log in from, you can see every location, and you can certainly block by region and IPs. And so, yeah, there's certainly extensible capabilities at the core infrastructure level.
All right, thanks. How do SaaS and PaaS compare?
Dave, you want me to take that, or do you want to?
I'm happy to chime in. I mean, I can certainly give my take on it. It's blurring, but I mean, a pure SaaS, there's really no extensibility. It's an application that you essentially create accounts and you potentially either create or import data into, and that's it, right? That's really what it comes down to, and that's where a lot of these things start. But a platform service, you've got a bit more extensibility in terms of not only things like applications that you can develop and build and sort of modify the entire construct of what's being performed or what's happening within that application scenario, but you've also got application interfaces that allow you to connect to either brokering services, internal services, extend that out to other cloud environments. It's a lot more extensible. So that's my take on it. As far as just overall, what's the difference between the two?
You hit it well. Nothing to add.
All right, thanks. I think we have time for one last question. Who usually owns SFDC governance and compliance?
You want me to take that, Dave, or do you want it?
Why don't you kick it off and I'll chime in. But I certainly have thoughts on it too, for sure.
Yeah, I would say the typical is not. I would say typical is atypical. The reality in most of the organizations that we're working with, it's a shared responsibility, which doesn't necessarily always lead to the best result. But somewhere between many of the large organizations that have multiple instances of Salesforce will have a center of excellence that is responsible for governance and responsible for governance reporting up through the InfoSec or compliance organizations. I'd say leading edge organizations that are really viewing the governance of their Salesforce environment as a mission critical application are having a more direct and active involvement from InfoSec and compliance. And more recently, we're starting to see CISO level involvement for what data do I have in Salesforce and how do I align it? And we think it's a great trend because there is tremendous value in most of the data that's in Salesforce, but I would say that's still early stages of it getting to that level from a priority standpoint. I don't know, how would you amend that or append that?
I mean, I guess I would probably couch this as it's a classic consultant answer. It depends, but it's very often sort of siloed within a particular application team or a business unit that has driven the move there in the first place, and it's either that or, as Brian was saying, like it's either this extraordinarily sort of spread out, governed sort of model that nobody agrees on anything and nobody ever really gets anything done. So there's a bit of analysis paralysis in terms of making great shifts. I think it's tough to say which one is the right model or whether there's a better model for this, but overall, security's got to be integrated into any of it. And if security is the last to know that there's, significant decisions being made in terms of app development and so forth that's that's always a bad thing. So it's a very difficult question, actually, but it's also a question that I'd say is extremely subjective depending on each team that we deal with.
Yep. Yeah, and I would say the other add is, so we do a lot of these, as part of the security risk assessment, we do these one-day workshops where we're really aligning all the constituents in an organization, and we won't do it unless there is representation from all those constituents, and our team of engagement leaders that runs those oftentimes refers to it as marriage counseling. And so you have the Salesforce team, you have line of business, you have compliance, you have InfoSec, all have a care and all have ideas of how their governance process should work within Salesforce. And what we help facilitate based on our expertise and having done this with lots of their peers and lots of these organizations is getting everybody aligned on a common trajectory or common strategy of how things should be governed thereafter, which is tremendously valuable and also really hard to do. And I think, to your point, your consultant had, sometimes it's better to have an outsider help facilitate that because independence is easier.
All right, well, with that, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Dave and Brian, for your great presentation, and to RevCult for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Dave.